மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
A little bit passively and a little bit close to the vest. Meanwhile, you just improve your position, and then we're going to outplay them. So that was one example. Another quick example, as I mentioned, another game I had, quite a recent game, semi-recent, about a year and a half ago. I was playing a FIDE master who's over 2400, and due to the tournament situation, he wanted to make a draw against me because he thought it would help his standing. So he actually ventured this line against me. But as I said, I think half of the battle here, or part of the battle here at least, is having the right attitude. You must understand that plenty of play in the position. Don't get discouraged if your opponent's going for the draw. So here's how that game went. I played e6. This time I played this little wrinkle, but for not much reason though, because I still played knight f6 afterwards. When I talked about knight e7, I guess if you play a move like bishop d6 first, you could consider bringing the knight to e7. Small way to unbalance the position. Maybe that's a plan you can use when white, for example, if white takes, and then castles, perhaps an idea to use is bring this knight to f5. I just simply keep these options as a reserve, just in case. But here, just knight f6, no tricks. Bishop g5 was played in this game, so a little bit different. Now we don't have that same plan of queenside expansion. So I played bishop to e7, rook e1, and queen c7. Again, remaining a little flexible. Am I going to castle short? Am I going to castle long? I should mention that I really don't recommend castling long unless, for example, white does something like trade on g6 or maybe play like h3, create some sort of weakness, because it's quite difficult to attack here on the king side with these knights sort of playing good defense, and these pawns are not very mobile because we're blocked by our own pieces. Meanwhile, white can strike at this hook quite easily with b4, b5. So, nevertheless, I like to... the queen on c7 is decently placed. I like to keep the options open. This is also a psychological thing. I want to keep my opponent on his toes. Maybe he's going to react in some sort of way which will, like I said, maybe he's going to get too aggressive, play like a4. And this way I will be quite happy to castle short because this may weaken his queenside. Or maybe he'll do something like h3. Now I actually will seriously consider castling long because he sort of weakened his position. So again, sort of like a mind game here. My opponent goes queen e2, does none of that. I decide it's time to castle short, as I said in the previous game. I like to make this exchange before castling so my pawns don't get doubled. I like to keep the integrity of the structure. Knight e4 is played. Rook d8. I'm just playing normal moves, developing pieces to the center. Of course, white is just trading off pieces. As I mentioned, he wants the draw, and I know this because he told me this after the game. But what can I do? I just need to play good moves. Rook ad1, rook f2, rook fe8. Now, knight f6, bishop f6, bishop f6, knight f6. So lots of pieces coming off the board, but I have no problem with that, really. I mean, I would prefer, of course, a more attacking, maybe dynamic game, but this position is perfectly acceptable for black. There's definite equality here. The only question is, where's the conflict coming, and how can we make use of it? So queen b3 is played, and now I finally decide to make my move b5. Very standard idea. Of course, usually what black does here is tries to play c5, get rid of this pawn here, but I didn't actually want to open the d file up yet. Simply played b5, get some space, prevent c4, win the d5 outpost, make the game a bit more imbalanced. c3, now I go rook d5, rook to e5, rook to d8. So, rather, not rook d8 first, a6. The idea of a6 is if my opponent wants to capture, now I maybe consider cd without this pawn hanging, and balance the pawn structure a little further. Rook e1, now rook d8. Again, the position is of course around equality, but still, queens to rooks, knights on the board, 7 pawns. By no means game over. And how the game continued was a4, h6. Not very exciting. h3, rook b8. Now sort of trying to generate chances on the b file. And now my opponent actually felt compelled to exchange for whatever reason. I played cd, ab, rook takes b5, queen c2, queen b6. And still, the position was around equal. But of course, now I have some play attacking on the b file. I have maybe a little bit more pawns in the center. Knight e4. I have some ideas of swinging my knight around. Perhaps I will push this pawn down the board, and I'll just tie his pieces down to b2. I did end up winning this game after a long fight. My opponent ended up making a mistake. But again, I just want to show you the attitude that I have in these variations, and I believe the attitude that you should have. You should be armed with the knowledge that, objectively speaking, these lines are no trouble. The positions are good for both sides. We both have our pieces out. We both have development. But you shouldn't be too focused on, oh, how do I avoid a draw? How do I avoid a draw? Just play good moves. There's lots of wood on the board, and the chances will come. Look for small and balancing moves, like for example here, play the move b5. Absolutely no danger in playing b5, grabbing some space. I can still play c5 in the future, for example, and I'm just carving out some light squares for my position. So I don't want to spend too long in this variation because white has lots of permutations of his development. Bishop d3, bishop g5, bishop f4, take on g6. Just want to give you the general gist here. Like I said, I face this variation a lot, or a lot relatively speaking to the other variations that I will show here. I should mention that as a total percentage of how many times I faced bishop d3 compared to how many times I faced the main lines, something like 9-1, so 10, maybe like around 10% that I faced this variation. Probably even smaller, I should think. So still quite important to know, and the biggest reason that I want to cover this first is because I know a lot of players who play the Kann who are very discouraged by this, or players in general. This is just general chess advice. Shouldn't be discouraged so early in the game by thoughts like, oh, it's going to be a draw. Just play the game, play good moves, and my strategy is always take small risks or minimal risks, but try to imbalance the position, and then you do it once, you do it twice, you do it 3 times, you look ahead, suddenly the position is getting a little bit more complicated, still in the safe zone, but you're getting more and more chances to outplay your opponent. Now we're going to switch and have a brief look at another variation that is actually, it's quite a funny one because it's very similar to what we just looked at. So we're going to look at knight g3, bishop g6, h4, so we're sort of going back to the previous chapter, but not really, because what I want to mention after h6, knight f3, knight d7. Here we've looked at only h5, and we've talked about white's motivations. He wants to have this cramping pawn here. He wants to shut down these pawns on g7, h6. Maybe he wants to use this pawn as part of the attack. But we've also seen in many positions that this pawn can become a weakness, and this pawn can actually be lost later in the game. So what some white players do, and a variation that I face sometimes, is the move bishop to d3, which just aims to keep the pawn at h4. Now, it's a funny variation because, I don't know, it's just something I'm using to me about white going into this whole line, but keeping the pawn a square back. And here we're basically going to play in the same exact manner that we've already learned in the classical variation. I haven't really been able to find any serious differences where white's going to have some big, idea because he kept his pawn on h4. In fact, I think this h4, h6, if we put these pawns back in their respective squares, I believe this would be better for white, because with the pawn on h4, you can't really consider the possibility of castling short. Meanwhile, why is this pawn on h4 in the first place? It can still be targeted, it can still be a potential weakness. So, looks a little funny, these two pawns on h4, h6. Of course, if we castle short, which we are planning to, then white can argue, of course, that he's going to he's done well to make us play h6, so to utilize this hook. But as we've seen in the previous chapter, white's really not really able to sort of outdo us. We have enough counterplay on the queen side as well. So here I just want to briefly show you one game where I faced this line against a close to master player who tried this idea against me. And the reason I want to show just one game is because I actually was able to show a downside of putting that pawn on h4 and not on h5. So what happened here was bishop d2, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, knight e4. So we've seen this already, but what difference is it going to make that the pawn is on h4 or h5? Knight takes, queen takes, knight f6, queen e2, queen e1 would be quite a novelty there, queen e2, and now queen d5. Same old idea, queen to the center, target a2, white played c4, and now queen e4. So we're going for this endgame. Let's see, how is this endgame going to shape up? Well, my opponent plays rook h to e1, reasonable move. I trade, rook trades, and now I played rook to c8. A mysterious rook move, so to speak. So again, these types of endgames, this actually, we've already talked about them in the previous chapter. I've also sort of alluded to these types of positions earlier in this chapter when I talked about these just positions that you think are drawish. Plenty of pieces on the board. Just try to keep playing, keep making good moves on balanced position. The idea of rook c8, simple. I'm considering c5. Now my rook is going to be well placed around the king. And I'm also considering ideas of b5, where my rook will also be well placed either on the open file potentially, or defending the c6 square. My opponent goes bishop c3, I castle. Now he goes b3, rook f to d8, again, mobilizing all my pieces, knight e5. And this is the moment where I want to really, this is why I was very excited to show you this excerpt here. Again, the position is completely normal. It looks like I have all the usual plans. Am I going to b5? Am I going c5? Again, I was higher than my opponent. I want to keep tension in the position, so I don't want to play a premature c5, get everything vacuumed off the board, and have to make a draw. When I have other good moves, maintaining the tension. And the move that I found here was quite interesting. I played the move h5. So you're not going to go h5? I'm going to go h5. What's the idea here? Well, first of all, white may be trying to play a move like g4, g5. So gain some space, chase my knight. So I say, no, you're not going to do that. Second of all, as I've talked about in the previous chapter, in these types of positions, white actually has a small weakness on d4. This d4 pawn is a little bit loose because, I mean, it's a stretch to call it a backwards pawn, but there are no pawns that can defend it. So my idea of h5 was to attack the pawn on d4. Now that sounds crazy, but here's what I mean. King b2, knight to e8. g3, since the pawn was hanging. Now I play knight d6. Do you see where I'm going? Bishop a5, b6, bishop back. So perhaps he wants to loosen up my queen side, but I don't think that was worthwhile at all. Bishop goes to f6, rook e3, knight f5, rook to d3. And this is what I was going for. The purpose of h5 was actually to put my knight on f5. So a new idea, a little bit unusual here, and generally it's not possible since white can play g4. But here this is a nice square, very hard to chase this knight away, can't play g4, can't prepare g4 because the pawns are loose. So instead here I fully tied down white's pieces to the defense of d4, bishop on f6 doing a good job as well. Of course white is solid, he has the square under control, but I was able to capitalize on my position. I simply played g6, slow improving move. White played f4 here, and I was very happy to see this move, creating this pawn chain with no protection of the light squares, and also this backwards g pawn. Now I played bishop g7, b4. It's a blunder, because after f6, the knight is actually trapped. If knight f3, then knight g3 wins the pawn, and in the game, knight g6 was played, but after king f7, knight is trapped, had to try g4, takes h5. Okay, material is not equal, but can't resist showing you how epic this position got. Knight goes to b6, king b3, b5, c5 was played. So zooming forward, because all matters is what's about to happen. Bishop e1, f5. So, quite crazy here. Rook e3, rook d5, and look at this formation. Boink, 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 boink. Everything on light squares, except this guy here. But he doesn't have a choice. He's a dark square bishop. So, quite a dream for the card comp player. Put everything in the light squares. And white is just positionally completely busted here. So, got a little carried away from the initial idea. Oh, excuse me, I actually played the immediate rook d5 here. After rook e3, I played f5. Small tidbit, but position is the exact same. Just too excited to show you this finale with these light squares. I went on to win the game. This game is, of course, attached if you want to see the rest of it, but all the cool stuff has already happened here. Again, just want to touch upon white omitting the move h5. As I said, most positions you can play generally the same way. Of course, keep an eye out in case something is a little different. But here I was actually able to use my opponent's lack of playing h5 against him by playing h5 myself and then targeting the d4 pawn. So quite an interesting idea there. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to knight g3 and we're going to consider the rest of white's options here. Now for all of these lines here, it's actually kind of a strange situation in my opinion, because all the lines we're about to look at are pretty respectable, decent lines. However, in my practice, like I said, I've been playing this opening for close to a decade. I've played hundreds and hundreds of tournament games, even more online games, blitz games, so forth. I haven't really seen these variations in practice against me or in general or in my students' games that often. So even though, like I said, these are like respectable variations, they have a body of theory behind them, they actually come around quite rarely. So this leaves sort of an issue. It's how much study time do we devote to these variations? On one hand, they should be treated with respect, and we should know what to do against them. On the other hand, we shouldn't go overboard studying all these lines that are going to come up once every couple of years. So the variations that we're going to finish off on here involve white basically not deploying this knight to f3 here. So what that means is that white actually has a number of setups where this knight goes to f4, either via h3 or e2.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.